Welcome to Fire Your Hiring Habits with John Mitchell. This is the place where we dive into the world of talent acquisition, explore the challenges of today's workplace, and discover what it takes to build a thriving and successful organization.
Welcome back to my conversation with Liz Wiseman, the CEO of the Wiseman Group and a top researcher on leadership and talent development. She is the author of bestsellers like Multipliers and Impact Players. Her books and articles have made her one of the world's most influential management thinkers. And speaking of impact players, Liz, how do you identify and select the impact players that you studied for the book?
Well, here's one of the secrets to my research is I never select the subjects. So when I wrote Multipliers, I didn't decide who was a multiplier and a diminisher. I went out to successful professionals and I asked them to identify leaders who had this kind of effect versus that kind of effect. And very similarly, when I'm looking for the most impactful people out in the workplace, I am not making that judgment. I'm asking managers to make that judgment. So I'm asking them, who's someone whose work is, who's doing work of extraordinary value, head and shoulders more valuable than their colleagues and the people around them. And so the essence of that research was asking managers, we asked 170 of them to identify two different contributors, both of whom were smart, both of whom were hardworking, and both of whom were capable and talented. So we're trying to neutralize those variables. Again, this is back to what I learned as a programmer, test one variable at a time. And what we're trying to figure out is what's different in the way that they show up and the way that they think about work and approach their work. So we're asking these managers to identify someone who is smart, capable, and hardworking, who's making an extraordinary impact and contribution to the team. And then someone who's smart, hardworking, and capable, who's doing a fine job. So we weren't looking at top performers and bottom performers. Everyone's solid in this pool. What are the people who are just doing incredibly impactful work? What are they doing differently than others?
And did you find, as you interviewed and researched these impact players, any common threads that stood out?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I think
how's that for a leading question?
Yeah. Yeah, we did. I would not have written a book if there wasn't something that jumped out there. What jumped out was, in essence, it's how they handle ambiguity and complexity and uncertainty. And maybe put the most simply is that they tend to move toward it rather than away from it. And as I looked at all of the differences, and it became clear that they handle certain situations differently than others. And these were the 5 that were common. One was how they handled messy problems. Problems without owners where it's not your job or someone else's job. It's not this department's group or that. It's all that messy stuff that isn't owned by anyone, yet probably because it's new. The second was how they respond to unclear roles when a team is collaborating but not entirely clear about who's in charge. You need a bunch of different players to make this thing work. The third is how they dealt with unforeseen obstacles. The kind of things you can't put a contingency plan together because you just have never encountered it before. Oh, well, that's a new one. The fourth is how they deal with moving targets when the situation's changing, the environment's changing, needs are changing, products are changing, budgets are changing. The last was how they deal with unrelenting demands where the workload is increasing faster than the resources are increasing. That kind of feeling of being perpetually behind, perhaps. And we found that they thought about those situations and handled them and approached them very differently than the ordinary contributor does.
Yeah. And the good contributors that you're contrasting it with, it's not like they're bad, like you mentioned before. These are all good players, but these are the people that just handle it better. So of those 5, is there one particular that's more important or foundational, or is that just the overall comfort with ambiguity that you just mentioned?
I don't know that there's one that's more important. We find that in different organizations and different industries, there might be one that's more prevalent or more important to master. But I think the first big conclusion I had from the research is not just that the impact players of the workplace handle these type of situations differently than others. It's, as a leader, your job is to help people navigate these kinds of situations rather than to skirt them, or as a leader to handle those yourself. Like, okay, you don't need to worry your pretty little head over this. Like, I'll handle the messy stuff. I'll provide role clarification. I'll deal with the big boulders that, drop in the path. Like, I'll figure out how to reset the goals. That ends up slowing down your team, reducing people's impact, having a diminishing effect. But your job as a leader is to help people be able to handle those situations on their own and as a team.
So is there a way for a leader then to develop impact players from their places? Do you have thoughts about, what advice would you give a leader saying, okay, you've got these great players. If you want to develop them into impact players, here's at least one thing that you ought to do.
Well, there's a bunch of things you can do. Number one, you can hire people.
Right. Find them, the people that already demonstrate this.
Who demonstrate this. And, it's probably worth saying that it's not like there are impact players and ordinary contributors out there in the marketplace and in the organization. These are modes that we tend to move in and out of. Some people work more fully with this impact player mindset. Other people have fleeting moments of impact. So you want people who feel comfortable working this way. And we looked at kind of the 15 big characteristics associated with these impact players. There's probably 3 that are harder to change. They're a little bit more permanent with someone. And these are great things to hire for and then coach the rest. This little trifecta is one, a really heightened sense of agency, what the psychologists would call an internal locus of control. It's simply this belief that things don't happen to me, that I can affect things in my world, in my job.
Just have that mindset that no, I can make a difference here.
Yeah, or I can make a difference, or that my boss isn't really in charge of me. I'm in charge of me. It's kind of continuing to channel our inner 6-year-old who says, you're not the boss of me. And I love this age with kids when they figure out that you're not really their boss. And they're like, I don't have to do what mom tells me to do. I'm actually in charge of my world. It's fun to watch them. So it's this strong internal locus of control. That's a little hard to convince someone of that when maybe they've grown up in more of a victim kind of mindset mentality. The second is a sense of informality, which is the name that put on it, which is that they don't take hierarchy too seriously. They're not well, I don't know, I can't speak up. I'm just a manager and that person's a senior manager and this person's a director. So who am I to say?
Couldn't agree more. Bring the ideas. When I was working at Bose, it was fantastic because if you had a good idea, you could get all the way to Dr. Bose at the head of the organization. He had no issues. Set an appointment. Just come talk to me. He was like, this is great. So you'd have engineers coming up saying this. He's like, that's great. Go build it. Go off. Do it. He'd just give permission.
And the impact players are the people who would take Dr. Bose up on that. Some people would be like, yeah, but who am I?
Can't, but he's too busy. And it's like, but
he's too busy. I don't
love that stuff. When people bring great stuff, that's what leaders want. I mean, I used to do I'd work with newer people in the workplace, mentoring them. And I had this one gentleman, he was an intern, and I just gave him some advice. I said, when you look at the problems that you see out there, you got to do your job. Can't ignore the job you've got. But other problems that nobody really wants to deal with, if you can come up with a solution, bring that to your supervisor, et cetera, and say, hey, what if we did this? Before the end of the summer, he was literally on a team reporting directly to the CEO because he was a problem solver. He was one that took action. This is what leaders love to find, people that are going to, it's that, like you were talking, informality. It's not about the level. It's about, I'm going to bring
about
value.
What you can contribute in the moment. That's the second of the trifecta. And the third is, it's kind of, I call it, they operate with this sort of opportunity goggles. And it's not like being optimistic amid chaos and problems. It's looking at a situation, acknowledging the threats, but then finding the opportunity. And so it's kind of being able to move through life not afraid of things that might shake us a little bit. And that's a little harder to coach and teach. It's like saying, oh no, don't be afraid. It'll be okay. Like certain people are carrying that with them. So, as a leader, what can you do? One, look for people who have those. Those are a little bit more immutable. The second, you mentioned this, John, with giving people permission. What I find is that this is the way how most people want to work this way. Yeah, there's probably a fraction of the population that's terrified to work this way, but most people want to. And it's not about teaching and training as much as leaders saying, you know what, when you encounter a messy problem, don't be limited by your job. See, because what we find is the ordinary contributor, they do their job and they do it well, whereas the impact players are doing the job that's needed, which is a very different approach to work. It's like, well, wait a minute. The job that's needed is not really my job. It's this problem needs to be solved. And so when it's a leader says, you know what, don't worry if it's not your job or swim lane, like go after it. You know what, don't worry if you're, a junior engineer, like feel free to act like the CEO of this problem.
We call it kind of an ownership mentality. If you own the company, what would you be working on? Well, we need to solve this.
Absolutely. And so this behavior, if I had one wish for managers, it's don't train people how to do it. Tell them about the differences and then give them permission to work this way. Like everywhere where you can set someone down this path in a way that's not going to be business ending, career ending, life ending for you or for them.
Making people feel like they're in a safe place where they can take those risks, that it isn't going to be a career threatening maneuver. It's like, no, you're fine. Do the right thing. And if it doesn't work out, sometimes it doesn't work out, and that's okay because you made the effort, and that there's learning there as well.
Absolutely. And you mentioned safety. And, I guess the third thing I would say, what can leaders do? Okay, so hire for this orientation, give people permission, and then create an environment that brings together two seemingly opposing forces. One of those is safety. The other is stretch. And, if I had to boil my work on multipliers down to 2.5 words, it would be safety and stretch. Is what the leaders do who get people's best thinking and best work is they create a safe environment, physically safe, psychologically safe, intellectually safe. Like they make it like they put a little bit of a floor there under people, but they don't leave it there. They're doing more than just creating a great place to work. They're expecting that people are going to do great work, and they ask people to do hard things, and they expect people to go solve hard problems, to speak up in meetings. So there's this stretch. But, if a leader is all stretch, no safety, that's a terrifying
exactly
environment. People shut down in this environment. People are exhausted in this environment. But if a leader is all safety, no stretch,
there's no growth.
There's no growth. And that's equally exhausting as you're sort of, demeaned, patted on the heads, like, oh, that's a great idea. That's a good one for the suggestion box. Oh, you're really thinking, but then no one does anything with this, or nobody asks, like people appreciate you, but never ask you to do something hard. And so when we can create that environment, it's very multiplier-esque, that's the environment where it's safe to be an impact player, but it's also like there's enough stretch that you can't kind of hang out in this ordinary contributor mode.
Yeah. So just to close out the impact players piece, what's one mistake that leaders often make that stifle potential impact players?
I think a common mistake that leaders in large organizations make is they take organizational boundaries way too seriously. These include things like job descriptions, workflows, escalation protocols, approval, matrices. Like, yeah, of course we need controls inside of our organization, but like if we treat job descriptions more like a starting point rather than an ending point, then people can work this way. So I think people take all of that formality of organizations way too seriously rather than, okay, you know what? We want you to do the right thing.
Yeah. What's the real underlying thing we're trying to accomplish here? We want to do it with integrity. We want to solve the big problem. The rest is kind of up for interpretation.
Exactly. Like, do not storm the corporate board meeting because you have a good idea. Like, don't take over the CEO's office. I think leaders do that. But then if I thought of like a behavioral thing, one of the most insidious forms of diminishing is something, it's the accidental diminishing, is that we tend to step in and rescue people when they're struggling with things. And when we decide as leaders that our job is to relieve people of hard decisions, hard work, difficult conversations, like we should not be surprised that people do their job rather than the job that's needed, that they escalate issues up rather than hold on to ownership, that they wait for role clarification from above rather than step up and just take charge and lead. And it usually comes from a positive place, if not a noble place, to want to help people. Like in some ways, the best leaders are not helpful.
Yeah, because they're letting their other people grow.
Yeah, it was one of the blessings of my early career is some people used to say, Oracle, wow, that was a tough place. Like, man, they eat their young there. And maybe some of that was true. I didn't really find that to be true. But what I found is a lot of leaders who asked me to do hard things and then didn't show a lot of mercy. And and they weren't that they were unkind. They just let me
go figure it out.
And these are things I didn't know how to do. But they were able to stand back and watch me struggle and sort that out and learn and grow rather than step in and do things for me. And it was an incredible blessing to work in a place like that.
That's great. That's like a perfect segue into multipliers. You talk about, the diminisher or the multiplier. So what inspired you to explore the differences between diminisher and multiplier in your book, Multipliers? Was there something, was the research demonstrating something, or did you just have this sense of it from your previous work, or, how did it come about?
I had a sense of it, and then I had an acute need. The sense of it was really trying to make sense of like really smart know-it-all jerk bosses. And I'm like, why is it that sometimes really, really smart, capable people, like once they get put into management, end up sucking the intelligence out of their organizations? Like they're smart, but
now
nobody
else
around
can
them.
be.
Nobody else gets to be smart around them. And I'm like, wow, we really worked hard to hire brilliant people. But then we put those people working for someone who's so brilliant that nobody else gets to think or nobody else needs to think. Like there's a learned laziness about this. But then I saw a bunch of other really, really smart leaders who you got to be smart around. And these are people who asked you to do hard things and then didn't do it for you. And like, why is it that we feel so brilliant around certain leaders, but yet around others we hold back? We feel stifled. We're like a fraction of ourselves. And this was this kind of this broad observation. It was a question I had, and it kind of came into focus when I was coaching an executive who was absolutely brilliant, is absolutely brilliant, pedigree education, Mensa, kind of smart, but he was struggling to create that kind of intelligence in his team. Like people held back around him.
Where it literally grows more as opposed to just saying, oh, well, you're so smart, we'll just listen.
Well, and that's really what's interesting. Like there are these know-it-all, micromanaging, bossy kinds of diminishers that in some ways seem like they're actively holding people back. Those are the rare breed. Most of the time, it's at the leader is just so capable that nobody else has to be uber capable. Like they're playing big so other people can kind of chill. Like we end up watching these leaders rather than trying to meet them where they are. And, I was
to the
coaching
front of the pack with them.
Exactly. And I was coaching this executive and I was explaining this idea that certain leaders use their intelligence in a way that amplifies intelligence in others. And like, I think he was the one who said, yeah, what you're describing here is like an amplifying effect. I'm like, yeah, I think it's amplifying, but it's kind of like a multiplying effect too. And so that's what caused me to pause, look for research. None existed. And that's where I decided I was going to really dig in and try to understand, why is it that some leaders amplify intelligence while others are suppressing it or draining it from their teams?
Got it. So as you started doing the research, is this what led you to the 5 key disciplines that set multipliers apart?
It is. I was looking for what is it that the multipliers do most differently from the diminishers. And they were how they managed talent, the empire builder versus the talent magnet, who's more than a good scout for talent. They draw them, and it's because of the work experience we get when we work around these leaders. It's a good gig.
Yeah, it's a great gig.
It's a great gig. Not only do you have a good job and a great environment, like you're given hard work to do. And it's the way they see us. They don't see you as like, oh, this is John, he's an engineer, therefore we'll slot him here. It's, oh, what does John's brain just do? Like, what's his mind built to do? And what are all the ways that we can use that at its like richest and fullest?
We were just discussing this similarly in our executive team here. I think it was just last week, talking about, as we bring people in, don't hire for the position. I mean, yeah, they should be able to do the position, but hire for their capabilities and their vision of what they could do. Because, right now, this is one of my frustrations with higher education and, education in general, is that even if it does prepare them for a job, which doesn't often happen, that job changes so fast, so often. I mean, right now, how many people have, capabilities with using, cognitive AI on their job description now that didn't exist a year ago? It just wasn't even there. Nobody even thought about it, So it's you need somebody that can, grow into whatever you want to throw at them.
Mm-hmm. I love this idea of growing into it. And, it's one of the things we see these leaders do is they give people a job that's a size or two too big. And I've got 4 kids, all now adults, but, I have not forgotten what it was like shopping for clothes or shoes for little kids. And, any parent who's been there knows that you never buy those shoes to fit. You always buy them a size or two.
A little bit big. And, when your kids are like, but daddy, but these don't fit, like my feet are sort of flopping around. You're like, you know what? You'll grow into them. Yeah. Give it a minute.
Give it a minute, little princess. You are going to grow into this. And that's really how we want to do, give people jobs that they can grow into. And then don't trap people in, this is your job duties and qualifications. It's more like, this is how your brain works. And so we can use it in temporary jobs. Like, in this project, in this conversation. And so that's the first, is how they manage talent. The second is the environment they create, the tyrant versus the liberator who gives people space. The third is how they set direction. And it's the know-it-all who gives directives versus the challenger who asks big questions. The fourth is how they make decisions. Diminishers tend to be decision makers, where those multipliers tend to be debate makers. Not on everything, but on the biggies, on the decisions that are going to really shape the future. The high stakes decisions. That's where they're like, I need to get all the right brains in the room. And we need to look at this from a lot of angles. We need to argue this. And the last is how they get things done. And, the diminisher tends to be a micromanager, and the multiplier tends to be an investor. They give other people ownership. They put other people in control.
So as you did your research, when talking about the differences between diminishers and multipliers, most surprising differences? Things you just didn't expect, like, whoa, what?
Well, okay. So there were some surprising ones, but my favorite was the one I suspected. On the survey that we did with everyone that we interviewed with, I think there were like 65 behaviors. I threw on a 66th, if I remember this right, and it was sense of humor.
Oh.
Yeah. Sense of humor was the thing that was most negatively correlated with diminishers, meaning they're not funny. And you think about it, everyone I've mentioned that to, they're like, oh yeah, my diminisher had no sense of humor. And it's not that the multiplier leaders are clowns.
Yeah, they just take themselves too seriously. They don't see the lightness in things around them.
They don't see the lightness. Whereas, diminishers are like, every mistake is serious. They take themselves very seriously, whereas the multipliers are a little bit lighter touch. They have a lightness about them. And we also found it was the sense of lightness and lightheartedness was one of the things that distinguished impact players as well. It's one of the 5 practices of these impact players where other people add to the burden when work gets hard. They make work light. And some of it is they lend a help a hand, but it's more about they have sort of a light touch. They're low maintenance. They don't make things harder than they have to be. And they bring a sense of fun and funny and joy. Like they're the kind of people who can just have fun while you're doing something really hard. They can laugh things off. And, it's one of the things that I ask managers, like, what is it that people do that make your job as leader, like, easy and delightful? Oh, when people are fun, they keep us laughing. I think it's one of these things that having this sense of humor is advantageous as leaders. It's advantageous as contributors. There's so many positive consequences of a sense of humor. There's a terrific book by Naomi and Jennifer, professors at Stanford. The book is called Humor Seriously. And they really lay out a wonderful case for the positive impact of humor in the workplace.
That's great. Last question. Let's close out on a positive one. What are some of the biggest benefits organizations can gain from having more multiplier leaders?
Well, the first is that they get more from people. And, it was one of the first things that I found in this research is, when I ask people, how much of your capability did that leader get from you? On average, diminishers are getting 48%, less than half of people's available know-how and intelligence. So think about the company. And I think because, John, you asked early on in our conversation how being a corporate executive has shaped me as a researcher. Here's one. I look at that and I'm like, wow, I've spent a lot of time in the CFO's office begging for headcount, like trying to get the resources I need to get this job done. And these multipliers are getting virtually all of people's capability. The diminishers are getting less than half. I'm like, that is a lot of wasted headcount. That is a lot of wasted money. And as a leader, just leading in some better ways can, in some ways, double your workforce for free.
Yeah, they're already there.
I'll take that. And I think then there's the more intangible. So you get people's best thinking, best ideas. People tend to take ownership and responsibility for things. In some ways, you get a team of impact players.
Yeah.
Rather than ordinary contributors, you build a climate where people are engaged, where they describe hard work as exhilarating, not exhausting. And so there's some immediate benefits, but for me, the big benefit is just, how do you want to be remembered as a leader?
Yeah. Do you want to be thought of somebody with the stick or the carrot, right? You want to be somebody that the place, I generated a fun place where we thrived and had a great time solving impossible problems. That's what I want to remember.
Rather than when you're no longer leading that person, it's a response like good riddance. Like I was, at my worst around them.
Very good. Liz, thank you very much. It's been a very enjoyable conversation for me. Thank you for taking the time with us on Fire Your Hiring Habits.
Well, John, thank you. And it's an absolute delight to talk with you.
Thanks again, Liz. And that wraps up another episode of Fire Your Hiring Habits. If you've enjoyed the show, please take a moment to subscribe and receive notification for new episodes. Also, if you could spare a minute, I would greatly appreciate it if you could leave a review to help others like yourself discover the show. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.
This has been Fire Your Hiring Habits. If you want to empower your organization to reach new heights, go to johnwmitchell.com to find the techniques and tools you need to attract and retain the best team and boldly reimagine your workplace. Fire Your Hiring Habits with John Mitchell is a production of Forbes Books.